This PowerPoint will take you through all of the vessels from identification in the Biology 202 lab. The PowerPoint images I'm using can be located under Media Library on Blackboard. I'm going to try and identify all the vessels that can be seen clearly on each one of these pictures. So if we start at the heart, you need to recognize that you can see all four chambers and all four valves. You have the right, just clicked out of the wrong picture. Let me get my ink pen back. I want a different color ink. There we go. The right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. In between the right and left, or the right atrium and right ventricle, is the tricuspid valve. In between the left atria and left ventricle is the bicuspid or mitral valve. We can see the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve. The other structures that we can see in the heart are the aorta, the aortic arch, the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins on each side. And what you want to keep in mind is that the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins extend all the way out into all of the lung tissue. So no matter where it may be labeled, out far away from the heart or very close to the heart, they're all pulmonary arteries if they're blue, and they're all pulmonary veins if they're red. We have the three branches off of the aortic arch: the brachiocephalic artery, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. The right brachiocephalic artery will then branch into the right common carotid and the right subclavian. When the subclavian artery passes the first rib is when it will transition into the axillary artery. When the axillary artery passes approximately the head of the humerus, it will transition into the brachial artery, and the brachial artery will continue until it reaches the elbow joint, where it will branch into the radial and ulnar arteries, and I will designate those on a later slide. If we go back up and look at the venous system, you have the two internal jugular veins coming down. Each one will join a subclavian vein to become the right brachiocephalic vein and the left brachiocephalic vein. Keeping in mind the right brachiocephalic vein is very short and the left brachiocephalic vein is longer. They join together to make the superior vena cava to bring all the blood from above the heart into the right atrium. Now the subclavian vein is also going to pass the first rib and become the axillary vein, and the axillary vein would eventually become the brachial vein. On your identification list, once it becomes subclavian and axillary, we want you to know a different path. Right where the subclavian vein becomes the axillary vein, there is a branch that comes off and begins to run down the lateral side of your arm. That's called the cephalic vein. And where the axillary vein would become the brachial vein, another branch breaks off and runs down the medial side of your arm, and that's called the basilic vein. Other things we can see from this view, very importantly, are the diaphragm, which designates the difference between the thoracic aorta and the abdominal aorta. We can see a piece of the inferior vena cava above the diaphragm, and then we see the inferior vena cava continuing below the diaphragm. When we look closer at that region, starting with the abdominal aorta, let's look at the 5 branches. The very first branch closest to the diaphragm is called the celiac trunk or celiac artery. On these models, it's obscured because the celiac artery comes off of the abdominal aorta by only a few millimeters before it branches. You are responsible for identifying 3 out of the 4 branches of the celiac trunk. The first branch on your model that moves superiorly in an S shape is called the gastric artery. The second branch that moves to the right side of your model over to the liver is called the hepatic artery. The third branch that's going to move to the left on your model over to the spleen is called the splenic artery. The celiac artery exists where those three branches meet. The next branch inferiorly on the abdominal aorta is going to be your superior mesenteric artery. And on this model, it appears no more than a stump without any of its branches. The third branch is a paired branch, one going to the right and one going to the left to the kidneys. Those are your renal arteries. The fourth branch is also paired, these small, skinny, shoestring-like arteries, which are the gonadal arteries. In the female, they would go into the pelvis. In the male, they would go outside of the pelvis to reach the testes. The fifth branch off the abdominal aorta is called the inferior mesenteric, and on your model, it only appears as a single branch on the left side. Now let's go back and do the branches off of the inferior vena cava. All of this is the inferior vena cava. So when we start at the top, closest to the diaphragm, we see a paired branch going into the liver. Those are the hepatic veins. Coming down is also a paired branch. Those are the renal veins. And then it drops down into the base of the pelvis, where I'm going to do the branches of the abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava at the same time because they are named the same. When the abdominal aorta and the inferior vena cava split in the pelvis, the first split is called the common iliac. So you see the common iliac arteries and the common iliac vein. Common indicates that a vessel or a nerve will split again. So the common iliac artery and vein split again into the internal iliac artery and vein and the external iliac artery and vein. Again, the internal branch and the external branch of the iliac artery and vein. The external iliac artery and vein will continue until they pass the head of the femur, where they will become the femoral artery and vein. We can see a portion of the femoral artery continuing down the leg. The femoral vein ends up cut off as a little stump only on the right side of this model. So it's suggested that you look on a different model to find an intact femoral vein. Another set of vessels I want to continue on are the ones available in this arm. So we said we had the cephalic vein running down the lateral side of your arm and the basilic vein running down the medial side of your arm. There is a vessel that helps to join the venous circulation from the lateral and medial sides called the median cubital, and that is that vessel right there. The brachial artery, remember, is coming down to the elbow where it is splitting to run one vessel down next to the radius called the radial artery and another vessel running down next to the ulna called the ulnar artery. The radial and ulnar arteries will meet in the palm of the hand to form the palmar arch. Another vessel that I want to point out is this vessel here, coming off of your axillary artery, wrapping around the head of the humerus. That is the humeral circumflex. There is a counterpart in the lower limb that wraps around the neck of the femur, and that is called the femoral circumflex. If we continue going down to the toes, let's start with the artery first. We had external iliac artery past the head of the femur. Now we have femoral artery running the length of the femur until it gets behind the knee. And now it's popliteal as it travels behind the knee before it splits into a posterior tibial artery that runs down the back of the leg, and then a fibular artery visible on the model's left side only at the very top and very bottom, but visible on the right side completely as it runs between the tibia and the fibula. Now we said the femoral vein got cut off up here, so it's not really intact on this model, but the vessel, the vein that we do see running the length of the entire leg, is called the great saphenous vein. It does not change names as it descends the limb, unlike the femoral going into the popliteal, going into the posterior tibial and fibular. It remains the great saphenous for its entire course all the way down to your big toe. What we do see on the top of the foot, or the dorsum of the foot, is the dorsal venous arch, as well as a portion of the fibular vein. The other system I want to highlight on this slide is the hepatic portal system. On the models, the hepatic portal system will always be illustrated as purple. So when we view it against the blue inferior vena cava, we can see that difference in color. I'm going to start over here in the spleen. There is a small purple vessel leaving the spleen called the splenic vein. It joins up with a small stump of a vessel called the inferior mesenteric vein. Once the inferior mesenteric vein joins with the splenic vein, it takes over the name, and as it travels across, it is all inferior mesenteric vein. It will join up with this larger vein that looks like a comb because it has vessels breaking off of it, called the superior mesenteric vein. When the superior mesenteric vein and inferior mesenteric vein join together, they will travel into the liver, where they were called the hepatic portal vein. So what you want to keep in mind is that the liver has 3 sets of circulation coming into it: hepatic veins, hepatic artery, and hepatic portal veins. This is a view inside of one of the torso models. So what we can see here are the superior vena cava, the 2 brachiocephalic veins, each brachiocephalic vein giving rise to the internal carotid and the subclavian, internal carotid, subclavian. We can see the aortic arch, which is with its 3 branches: brachiocephalic, left common carotid, left subclavian. We can see here's brachiocephalic going into subclavian and carotid on the right side, carotid on the left side. And we can see, most importantly, the heart has been removed, and as the aorta goes behind it, it's called the thoracic aorta. You also get a view of the pulmonary veins, pulmonary arteries, and again, it does not matter where in the chest they are. The blue lines in the lungs are going to be your pulmonary arteries, and the red lines in your lungs are going to be the pulmonary veins. Looking into the abdomen of your torso model, you can see your inferior vena cava, your abdominal aorta. We see that first branch underneath the diaphragm is the celiac artery. The second branch is the superior mesenteric artery. We see the renal veins coming from each kidney. And one thing we can see on the torso model that we can't see on the circulatory board is the vessel leaving the adrenal gland coming down to the renal vein. This vessel is the adrenal or suprarenal vein. And again, when these 2 large vessels split in the pelvis, you're going to have common iliac artery, internal iliac artery, external iliac artery, and then they would continue down through the inguinal ligament, past the head of the femur, and change their name to femoral.